the message. Thank you. We want to convey the message that one solution doesn't fit all, that solutions, policies have to be adapted to the experiences, to the knowledge, but also to the needs of the different communities. And also in that context, we'll come back to art and see how art can contribute to help find solutions. Before opening the panel, which is organized and co-organized by PDD together with Secours Catholique and the, what is it, Migration and Displacement Platform. Exactly, thank you very much. And it's co-sponsored by Switzerland, Fiji, and Kenya. Before we start with the panelists, I would like to invite Ambassador Flückiger, the Deputy Director, SEC, to make some opening remarks. Over to you.
Many thanks. Many thanks, Professor Kalin. Where do you want me to stand?
Stand, sit.
Okay, I can walk around. So, yes, climate change, people and art. So we heard about what art can do, what art can express, what culture can express. It's about a lived or a felt reality. Sometimes it's premonitory. I remember it was, I think, in 1998. we were working in Côte d'Ivoire, and we had a project where we basically gave a theater group of street children the opportunity to put a play together. They had carte blanche. And what they put together was exactly what happened 12 years later, a conflict, an eternal armed conflict, and what the consequences it had for the population. So art can be an expression of what is felt now, what is coming in the future, but it definitely helps prepare and contextualize. We do that also in Switzerland. So you may have seen, and if you have not seen, there is an exhibition. It's called SMART, Sustainable Mountain Art, on the first floor of the Congress Center over there, where artists from all over the world came together and actually look at the impact of climate change on mountain regions, even here in Switzerland. So how do we translate these? How do we bring art then again to climate change, migration, pathways, and policy? We have been working on resilience, adaptation, mitigation of climate change for many years. We do this at a country level, at a regional level, and at the global level in Swiss Development Cooperation. Really going from emergency assistance to early warnings, to disaster risk reduction, to then long-term development investment, and then of course the protection and the assistance of people on the move and where they end up settling down. So we have supported orderly and regular migration pathways in the regions affected by climate change for a long time. Of course, climate change affects, as most mishaps in this world, the poorest and the most vulnerable the most. They often live in the highest exposed areas. They don't necessarily have the means to prepare, or they don't have the information to prepare. They also don't have the information or the knowledge on what to do, and very often they most definitely don't have the means to actually move and go somewhere else. So And I think this is the key message of this entire session. In all our interventions, we put people at the center. And this is what art helps us do, put people at the center of our work. And particularly those most vulnerable, very often women, boys and girls in the most exposed communities who are disproportionately affected by climate change. We also put a particular attention on those who are involuntarily stuck. So it's the involuntary immobility where people just have no other choice than to stay and somehow find a way to cope. So access to information, again, early warning, and then the adaptive pathways for mobility are central. Climate change is global. We all know it. The effects are always local and regional, and the coping and adaptation and resilience mechanisms to stay always have to be local, as do the art projects, which can help us translate some of this. Switzerland has played a role also at the policy level for many years. So ever since the Nansen initiative to the adaptation platform, then on disaster displacements and your new strategy, 2030. This initiative is really spearheading for the international community. It supports states, stakeholders. It fosters policy coherence, so as we address climate change, displacement, risk reduction, and human mobility. So it will remain crucial. So art and policy are linked. Sometimes we probably would like a little bit more art and creativity in policy, and we would like more future-looking policy. What we see in the multilateral system, and we have seen in recent times, is more pushback and return into a past where we actually don't want to be anymore than looking forward. So we're fighting, we're pushing back on the pushback. Maybe art will help us to overcome this and genuinely look into the future and, come to the ambitious policies at the multilateral level, at the regional level, at the local level, and their implementation, which we really need if we want to tackle climate change and if we want to tackle climate change in a way that also and particularly supports the poorest and the most vulnerable. So looking forward to the discussion, and back to you, Professor Khan.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Frutiger, and of course your correct title is Assistant Director General, Head of the Thematic Cooperation at SDC. Sorry for my slip before.
Just lost another 2 minutes.
Yes, exactly. And that's why now we are turning to our eminent panel. I'm so happy and glad to have you here. People with so much experience from the ground level. And just let me introduce our panelists before I hand over to you. First, Ms. Bernie Goulding, Director, Diversity Network Australia and member of the Pacific Women's Indigenous Network. She is a nurse and educator. She has authored 2 books entitled Color Outside the Lines, One Girl, Two Tribes, and Children of the 12 Tribes, and has been working with Indigenous communities since decades, 1992, yes, yeah. Thank you so much for being here, but also for your work in so many sectors: health, safety, community development, disaster response, human rights. And I must say, she has set a new notion of Pacific time, because she was the first panelist to arrive here. Then we have Mr. Mamadou Goita. He is speaking here as chair of the Pan-African Network in the Defense of Migrants Rights. He is a development socioeconomist from Mali. university professor, researcher, land specialist, contributing to so many socioeconomic studies, evaluation process in Africa and other continents. He has worked on issues related to climate change and migration in West Africa for also over 20 years. And I'm looking forward for your insights on the topic today. And then next, Ms. Mary Mattingly, visual artist, lecturer, a Guggenheim Fellow. Her work has been exhibited in various museums around the world, has been featured in really the big medias, New York Times, BBC, etc. What her art interest is, and we'll hear much more about that, of course, is the mounting ecological crisis, but how to respond to that, for instance, by modes of production. We'll hear about food, for instance. And also, she will tell us about how art can influence policy. So building up on what Ambassador Flückiger just was telling us. Mr. Shakirul Islam is the founding chairperson of Ovibashi Karmi Unnayan Program in Bangladesh. He's their chairperson, but he's a migrant activist. And it's good to have this activist voice here, but you're also a researcher. You're bringing together everything. You have conducted several research on issues of migration, migrants' rights in the context of climate change, to bring the perspectives and voices of migrants into the discourse. And you will, if I understand correctly, talk about existing pathways through labor migration corridors, but then also the challenges linked to that. And last but not least, Ms. Helena Olea, Associate Director for Programs at Alianza Americas, lawyer, more than 15 years of experience, also as a university professor, as a researcher in human rights, migration, refugee and gender. Also an NGO person working in NGOs in Colombia, Chile, the United States. And we also will hear about how to engage in policy making on regular pathways. So that's our eminent panel. And let's start to hear from your experiences, of what it means for communities, human mobility challenges, how they to respond to them, and again, what can we learn for the policy level? Over to you, Bert.
So Bula Vinaka, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today, and I would just like to acknowledge that I have a number of Pacific representatives who were not able to attend, and so I'm just reflecting that they had contributions that we were unfortunately able to not hear this time round. I come from a long line of navigators that are the most prolific explorers that the world has ever known. At a time when many of your ancestors were walking very short distances, we were sailing thousands and thousands of miles across the Pacific backwards and forwards with our Google Maps, and certainly without any other way of navigation other than intuition and knowledge that had been passed down. I'm also acknowledging that Pacific Islanders are the most resilient people in the world. We live in the disaster-prone area. The Oceania region, of course, is number one in terms of risk, but we have the top 3 countries, and then we have another 6 or 7 that are in that top 15 list. So natural disasters exacerbated by climate change, not of our causing, are certainly putting us in the front line. And when you look at history for Pacific Islanders, it reads like the worst tragedy. In terms of our recent history, we've been colonised, divided. People had wars over the Pacific, which doesn't often get talked about. European wars, you're very good at keeping your history, but Pacific, not so much. So we didn't even bother to count the number of people who were killed in World War II. We didn't bother to count the people left behind who helped Allied troops, and were then murdered or maimed or tortured because they had provided that support. So that happened in the majority of Pacific Islands. I did also want to point out that after all of that help for the Pacific towards allied and peace after World War II, unfortunately some of the countries that came then decided the Pacific would be a good place to test your weapons. So in peacetime, 315 weapons were tested by the French, by the US, by even Great Britain in our region. So all of that gets lost, and that's what we've been left with. And then you look at, in terms of, unfortunately, when people came in the Second World War, you found all of those resources. And so then you came back to get them. And so unfortunately we have, in large parts of Papua New Guinea, West Papua, which doesn't get talked about, and pretty much the rest of the Pacific, the Solomons, all of the countries have been decimated by mining and resource stealing. And yet still we smile and we don't complain. And so that has unfortunately enabled some of those bad behaviours to continue. And you watch climate change happen and still not complain. And in some areas that narrative is missed. And so then the story that happens for Pacific is where the new migrants that need support, when we don't look at what was happening before, that has contributed to the place where we find Pacific Islanders now. So I think in terms of the narrative, the storytelling is so important because it changes the story from more migrants that need our support that we don't want in countries like Australia and perhaps New Zealand, Canada, Britain and America, which are quite often destination countries for our people. And then it becomes more of a restorative justice discussion and also reparation. So what can we do to make some form of amends for what has happened? So that storytelling is part of what I do. I did, when I first started researching history, I went back and had a look at those stories and I tried to tell them to school children, but they didn't know and neither did their parents. And what happened is I was inadvertently traumatising people because now I'm telling them things that they didn't know. So for me, that gentle telling of history is really important. In countries like Australia and New Zealand, we are very, very proud of our Anzac history, our working together. And so part of that narrative does need to be the inclusion of Pacific Islander people. In terms of now, I am so thrilled to see climate change. We have lots of leaders in there who are doing amazing work. They are resilient. They can, in between all of the slow-moving climate change, we've got disasters now exacerbated by climate change. So you bring it. Volcanoes, tsunamis, floods, cyclones, and bring not just little ones, bring category 5s now, because that's what we now have. And yet still these people continue to want to stay because we're tied to land. We're tied to villages, we're tied to our islands and also our provinces. And if I had $100 million, and this is a question I ask islanders all the time, where would you choose to live? And the answer is always back in my island. So if I had money that could support me and my community, then that is where I'd live. So I guess the 3 points for me that's really important about what we can do to help leverage the challenges that now face Pacific people in terms of migration, but also climate change. The stories really are, tell the truth about what happened, but do it in a way where people can listen, both Pacific Island people, but also host countries. The second thing is, how do you prepare people to leave when they have all of the grief attached to leaving their communities and their land? And how do you set me up for success in my host country when the narrative is, unfortunately, juvenile justice, we get targeted in terms of the focus from media. Quite often we'll talk about Pacific Islander youth and the problems that they have. Quite often they are co-named with African youth, even though combined in countries like Australia and New Zealand, we make up less than 1% of perpetrators of violence, but quite often we become the main overarching story. So setting up and making sure that it is fair and just, and making sure those people are connected to communities in the host countries. At the moment, diaspora, and so for me, that's who my family is at the moment, we provide on a voluntary basis support for Fijians, but also other Pacific Islanders. That's just part of what our communities do. But I'm acknowledging that a lot of Pacific Islanders in host countries are not in a position to provide support both for their own families, for people at home, and also for people coming in. So it's massive stretch of resources, but they do it, again, without smiling or complaining. So the last thing I did want to flag is that you need to leave the door open, because if there is a possibility, the majority of Pacific Islanders I know will want to return to their islands. And so making sure that the islands aren't lost and that we're adopting climate change real action that makes a difference is going to be key for the survival of Pacific Island people. Manaka sarva levu.
Thank you so much for this very impressive presentation, highlighting that we should not silo issues. Because if I'm looking at the international discourse on the Pacific region, then it's about climate change, it's about climate justice. But all of that, as you highlight, is connected to a wider history. Here, a wider history of racism, of colonialism. And if you're not having that kind of holistic approach to what communities now affected by the impacts of climate change, if you're not taking that into account, then I think it is difficult to move forward. So understanding that history, I think, is really a conclusion that not many people see. So thank you. Now moving from a watery world to a more dry world, Western Africa, Mr. Mamadou Goita. What about communities, their human mobility in Western Africa, where of course there are some similarities, different forms, but of conflict, of a colonial past, of communities looking for justice? Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm so pleased to be here with you and discussing about this climate issue linked to the mobility of people globally in Africa, because you know that it's a diversity of countries, but a lot of similarities if you look at regions. Africa has 5 regions. The sixth one is what we call the diaspora. And particularly if you look at West Africa, you have 2 sets of countries, those who are the coastal area and the what we call the Sahel countries. Because a big majority of the countries in West Africa are from the Sahel region, including Burkina Faso, Mali, Mauritania, because Mauritania is part of North, but has been for a long time member of ECOWAS. And Mali and even Côte d'Ivoire as a part of the Korogo, this northern part, is also similar to what we have in Mali. It's a long history. I think that we have the same historical background with slavery, colonization, and exploitation of resources that have been really instrumental of what we have today. We cannot talk about climate variability and climate change without linking it to the global international policies and relations and geopolitical issues that have been really facing this continent, and particularly West Africa. Actually, communities are suffering a lot. You have flood in some regions, that you have drought. I have to remember that in 1972, 1973 rainy season, there was no, in some region where we had almost 800 millimeters of rain, we have less than 100. That is the first big drought that we have been facing in the Sahel countries, all the Sahel countries, and that gave birth to SEALs. This is a inter-community, interstate organization against Sahara, that we have been calling it SEALs. It's because of people at that period in the northern part of my country, for instance, I'm from Mali, have been obliged to move to the southern part, creating the first generation of community conflict at that moment already. In the 70s, if you look at the first generation of migrants from Mali to France, because of linguistic also commitment, are from the region where this drought had been severely stacking people, contributing to devastate the cattle, and then population have been obliged to move. And some, it's not an anecdote, but I will say it in an anecdotal way. The government have been obliged to some extent just to ask people from the south, those who can marry, and if you can feed a woman, that is really a shame. If I think about it today, so you marry her, if you can feed her, you get married for free. Because they want just people to move from that region. The severity of the calamities at that period have been pushing people to move forward, to go in the southern part and creating some of this historical conflict that we have today. Because those people came, and when there was a squeezing of spaces for production, it created conflict between herders and agriculturalists, and then also fisher folks in the central part of my country. So communities have been stuck already for that period, and it creates another implication that people don't talk about, because the loss of the genetic resources in this region was due to the food aid that came at that period, because it has been also very instrumental in creating, squeezing the genetic heritage that we have in this part of my country. Look at seeds, how they disappear completely in some cases, how we have been losing also, all this mentality of those who are struggling daily to produce for their own survival, but also for linking them to other communities, because it's created a kind of laziness, in terms of ability to react. This is why the northern part of Mali, you take Tombouctou, Gao, and Kidal, people have been waiting for food aid, and it started from that period. It completely changed the eating habit of the communities. So those who are used to just produce millet and sorghum and the like have completely been taken out of that, and then wheat and maize and cane, because we're feeding people with wheat powder coming from the US particularly. Rice came on board on that, and with the implication that we have today. These are things that people are forgetting. And it pushed those who are producing this product to move from their lands and then go elsewhere, and emphasizing then on commercial crops instead of just working on the crops that are really common for the food system. They are not talked about enough. The implication of this climate damage on the genetic resources squeezing, but also the inter-community conflict that have been created for that period. Countries like Cote d'Ivoire, also in West Africa, in the independence period in 1960, Cote d'Ivoire has 14 million of forests. Now, there are less than 3 million of forests in this country, because it has been also used as a period just to create conditions for them, saying that, okay, so since people are suffering from this drought, poverty is linked also to this climate mobility movement of people with a lot of vulnerability. Now, this is the period that have been chosen by some of my institutions to create what we call the structural adjustment programs. Because countries have been indebted not only in the 70s and the 80s. So the mid of the 80s, we had the SAPs that emphasize on the fact that we need to produce commercial crops to get some financial resources on the international market for just paying back the burdens of the debt burden. So Cote d'Ivoire has been oriented toward coffee and cocoa production, while people were eating as food cassava, more yams and the like. So not only we assisted to the disappearance of these because of the climate variability on that, but also the loss of even the capacity of a country just to react to this kind of situation. So communities are actually moving. It's created a lot of, if you do the mapping of a conflict in West Africa, the biggest share of it, it's about 62%, are linked to climate mobility, because people have been moving, and now some are claiming back their lands that have been taken from that. And what is going on actually is that we have policies, we can talk about them later on. We have policies at a Pan-African level, but how they are implemented is another problem, because you are more on the conjunctural solution than the structural things. So it's very important just to highlight this point. Since they are not mentioned that much, I want just to emphasize on this linkage between climate change and on all the implication on the food system.
Thank you so much. People like me with gray hair very well remember the 70s and the big drought then. And taking also that historical dimension into account. Also starting to rethink how, for instance, humanitarian aid is shaped and what the longer term impacts are I think, very important lessons that can be learned from what you just presented. Also, the linkages between climate change, but then also the economic systems and food production is an important aspect. And that's exactly what now our next speaker, Ms. Mary Mattingly, will talk about food.
Well, I can skip the images, but maybe it's, okay. Okay. So I'm an artist, and I think I'm gonna just start by saying art is about questioning to me, and I'm really, Talk to, okay, yeah. So I'm driven by access to fresh food, by access to clean water and mobility, how to stay. Adapting to climate change through mobile forms requires different ways of thinking, of reimagining, and of working together. Climate adaptation for me can be regenerative, it can be collaborative, and artists can play a really integral role in imagining and enacting those alternatives. So my experience growing up in a place without clean drinking water had to do with industrial agriculture in an area that was also continually flooding. All of this sort of drove me to make sculptures that I called wearable homes. I'm gonna go back, sorry, I'm just getting used to this. Wearable homes cleaned water they could inflate to make different types of shelter. These wearable shelters sort of described issues relating to mitigating, to adapting, and to resilience to climate change. Another approach to adaptation and migration, I think, is through illustrating small-scale ecosystems. So I'm gonna advance some. This portable ecosystem cleans rainwater and also asks people to learn from portable habitats that contrast with general surroundings while providing space for imagination. Questions regarding climate migration are different depending on the place. So what could infrastructure look like so people can stay in a place affected by rising sea levels? This is a project called WaterPod. It asked that question about living in a future New York City. People were able to live on the WaterPod in New York's harbor, including myself. And unlike this picture, it was usually docked. So you can imagine people were coming on board, learning from the ecosystems and really contributing to them. This project was built entirely from the waste chain without any money as a community endeavor. And I think through WaterPod, this is a project where I really fell in love with what public art could do. New York residents from all over the world came to visit the WaterPod and all had better ideas about how to care for these living systems. There were 4 chickens, how to feed the chickens through what we were growing. In a way, traditional ecological knowledge and appropriate technologies were really implemented here. WaterPod was when I learned that art could also be knowledge sharing and trust could be built through art. So this changed my way of working. In the beginning, I was working with photography, and I started to work on these large-scale, more participatory projects. Let's see. An illustration of the designs. As a model, it's really important, I think, that the system is accessible and that visitors' input are always valued. Because when people can imagine their daily surroundings for climate adaptation, we all have more agency to model alternatives for one another and find, in my case at least, I found a greater respect for the land, the water, for opening more people up to different forms of reciprocity. So I'll skip through these. So aside from making portable architecture and mobile ecosystems, I wanted to share 2 projects that underscore rising sea levels for me. This is called Ebb of a Spring Tide, and then I'll share Swale. So Ebb of a Spring Tide is a public artwork on New York's waterfront, which is where I live. It's based on an apartment building I used to live in that began flooding when storm events met high tide. So this is a regular occurring issue now, that apartments are flooding even away from the shore just because of how it's built up. So at this point in time, I had nightmares about flooding, which led me to get to know the tidal shift and to anticipate the water coming in. And eventually I had to move. When I was invited to make a sculpture here, I designed it to resemble this dream that I had about this deconstructed apartment building with water leaking between the floors. And it contained a water clock. Here you see elements of it that utilized the ocean water and that sped up and slowed down with the rising tides. So the water running through the water clock grew salt-tolerant plants in a salt garden that included strains of potatoes, onions, carrots, tomatoes, kale, cabbage, and herbs. And this is something that I've implemented later on different projects where with saltwater inundation from rising sea levels, there are still plants that will grow. So Ebb of a Spring Tide asks people to imagine what relocation and adaptation could maybe look like simultaneously. The more a place can adapt, the more we're tasked with envisioning and enacting alternatives as residents and as policymakers. So while this whole project was temporary, the plants stayed, and in a small way could help prevent future flooding and simultaneously create more resilient food sources. So I'm going to go to the last project now, and it's called Swale. I wanted to say the UN acknowledges there are an estimated 2 billion people around the world whose livelihoods and lives depend on access to commons-managed water, farmland, fisheries, and forests. Their governance systems are characterized by reciprocity, by resource pooling, and stewardship. This barely exists in New York in a large way, but this project called Swale asked about it. You know, what could publicly accessible urban food forests that potentially models a commons in a place where everything is so privatized, what could it look like if it was mobile and if it was floating? So Swale is an intentionally provocative artwork. It's a public floating food forest on a barge. The pilot project existed from 2016 to 2020, and it addressed the need for access to fresh food and rising sea levels through a mobile floating platform, an unusual way to make a land base for what's arguably one of the oldest forms of gardening, agroforestry, or ecosystems of perennial plants with herbs, fruit trees, nuts, and berries, generating a companion planting method. So they need less maintenance, and unlike industrial agriculture, they can grow stronger and more plentiful each year. So Swale started because people foraging food from plants grown on New York City's public land has been illegal for almost a century for the fear that so many foragers could really destroy an ecosystem. And a food forest built on the water can follow other rules. So Swale found a loophole to go around public land laws in New York City by being on the water. And it was important that Swale wasn't only a place where people could pick food for free, but like a community garden, could also care and steward food. In that way, I think Swale was experiential on different levels. Young people almost always learned to care for the plants first, and then they brought their families in. So imagine walking onto a moving barge, docked at a city park, to find that it looks, smells, and tastes like land, but it feels very different. And slowly, as you grow accustomed to this moving vessel, your perspective can shift, and it can look like the city is moving back and forth, and the land that you're on in this mobile food forest begins to feel stable. So your perspective shifts, and I think that's really necessary when you want to ask people to embrace an idea that's an alternative, to work towards climate adaptation in different ways. So on Swale, people also brought their own seedlings and planted foods that would be ready in time for someone else in another neighborhood to harvest. Mobile ecosystems can have a way of bringing people together who don't know each other but want to support each other. And finally, as a direct result of swale, a land-based initiative also occurred. So in 2017, New York City's government broke their own law, and the Parks Department opened their first land-based pilot, a public foodway and concrete plant park in the Bronx. So if there's enough additional interest from residents in stewarding edible plants, they will do more. And I think that's how I see public art like swale, which moves from place to place and re-enlivens what's possible, sort of as a model for other things happening as well. Swale's one example of a way that art can be part of coalition building and can affect change through mobile infrastructure in the face of climate catastrophes. And I'll just finish up by saying that, like most art, this art comes out of my personal experience. A lack of clean water led me to build wearable homes. A flooding apartment led me to learn more about salt-tolerant farming. And learning that I had an autoimmune disease led me to look at access to fresh food in a city where it's prohibitively expensive and it's illegal to forage on public land. But I think art is so much more than that initial impulse. In this case, in the case of most of these projects, I've seen it grow and change when more people are involved, and that's when I've seen art really be able to trigger collective imagination and even lead to policy change. So finally, I just wanted to say that I've been making art that I believed in because I really thought that I had nothing to lose, but I now understand that collectively, if we don't do anything, we really have everything to lose. So I'm going to end there, and I will show the next model of this project and its future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Yes, that's exactly the kind of imagination, crazy ideas that make us think. And I was told yesterday morning when somebody from the Pacific Island region passed by our booth where there was the picture of the boat, the person said, "Wow, can we grow food on ships?" So that's exactly the kind of provocations that are good to inform policy. And it's also interesting because your example shows it's also an issue of the global north. And you have a video we cannot show because of time constraints, where it becomes very clear it's the poor marginalized communities that have very much profited from that project. So unfortunately, we have to go on. May I ask you to give us the perspective from Asia, South Asia, labor pathways?
Thank you very much, especially to the organizers to invite me and give me this space to share our own experiences from the ground, from our community. And I know that you all are well-known experts in the area of climate change and migration, but I just want to explain when we talk about sea level rise, what does it mean in our lives at the community level? So the thing is, because of the sea level rise, now the communities where we belong, we are representing, is the coastal belt of Bangladesh. So over the last 15 years, the tidal surge has been increased and has been higher than before. And it's like that the tidal surge occurred, bring a high level of water in during every full moon. So what does it mean actually? It means that the high tides, they're coming and actually hitting the weak embankments that we have. And when it is hitting repeatedly, then the embankments are broken. And when the embankments are broken, then the water are coming into the communities. And when the water are coming into the community, it means that it's flooding. It's flooded the crops, it's flooded everything and destroying house and all these things. On the other hand, when we are talking about the coastal area, it means that the water is from the sea. From the sea, it means that it's saline water. So when the saline water are entering into our community, it means everything is being salinized, and salinization is a huge problem. And when it is salinization, what are the impacts on our lives and livelihoods? It means that, I just want to show this research document you might have seen. It's thanks to Secours Catholique Caritas for collaborating to conduct this study. But I just want to show the photo of the cover page that there is water everywhere. Everywhere we have water, but we don't have any drop to drink because all water are saline water. So when it is, we don't have any water to drink, then that means that we need to fetch drinking water far away. And we need to give a lot of labor. We have to spend a lot of money. But on the other hand, there are other complications on our health because we are using this water in our everyday life. So reproductive health, particularly for the women, is very, very much affected by using this saline water. And when it's not only reproductive health, it is also creating skin diseases. And that's why the families, they are organizing marriage of their young girls, the adolescent girls, so that, before getting their skins orsed or being affected or infected by reproductive health problems. And when the adolescent girls are getting early marriage, there are other consequences. There are early pregnancy, early delivery, and then, gender-based violence. So all are the consequences when we talk about salinization. So if you link the sea level rise, how it is impacting on the lives of the people on the community. So that's just some example that I'm giving. And if we talk about the support systems for us, there is no continuous support. There is no longer-term support. It's only provisional. When the cyclone comes or when the flood happens, then the government or the other organizations come with some kind of relief. So, relief is not sustainable, right? So people actually depend on loan to rebuild their houses, to rebuild their life and livelihoods. But unfortunately, the next disaster comes and flooded everything, destroy everything. So that's why people actually fall into a debt trap. And when they fall into debt trap, they have no other options in the community. So many of them are forced to migrate. And in our research, it's showing that 70% household of that particular community have at least one migrant member. And majority of them migrate internally because they don't have enough money to take part in the existing labor migration regime. And there is no special facility or mechanism so that the climate-induced people can migrate in a safe way. So that's the problem. And you all know that there are very few pathways for migration, and one of the pathway is labor migration. And from the community which I am representing, now over the last 12 months, the international migration has been increased 65%, and it's a huge increase within 12 months. And as there is no other options, there is no other pathways, so they are following the labor migration pathway. And you know that labor migration pathway is very much unprotected because of the kafala system, because of the sponsorship system tying with the employer. So there is a huge abuse and exploitation of the workers. And our research is saying that 81% returning migrant workers say that when they migrated to the traditional destination countries, particularly in the Gulf, they didn't provide any work permit. They didn't provide any job or salary that was promised before they migrate. That means that they are falling into more critical, abusive, exploitative situations with the loan burden on their head. And when they are returning back, again, they have loan burden and they have no way to pay. So it's really, really very difficult critical situation, and it's really difficult to express the sufferings of the people when they migrate through this kind of unethical, unfair labor migration corridor. And if we talk about the refugeeism, I mean the asylum seek processes, it's not so easy, particularly for the climate-induced people, because the definition is different, and it needs to provide a lot of proofs, evidences from the people that, yes, they have the right to apply for asylum seek. So it means that there is no legal or regular pathway for climate-induced people. So they are ended up in a situation of human trafficking, forced labor, modern slavery, in all the way of migration. So that's really I mean important that we need to think when we talk about the protections and the policy and all these things. And from our experiences, I mean in Bangladesh, that we have a very good policies on climate change issues. We have very good policies on migration issues, but there is a lack of connections of these policies. And it really needs that we think of a very coherent policy which actually address the issues of climate-induced people. And if they want to migrate, then we really have very specific pathway for climate-induced people, so that they have, they can ensure safe, regular migration. On the other hand, I mean, if we talk about rights-based approach, then definitely we actually focus on the fundamental rights that we call right to stay and right to live. So even though the community are facing many difficulties in the context of climate change, but 70% household, they do not want to migrate. They want to stay back because they say that it is our ancestral land. We belong to our own culture. We have, in our communities, it's our own community. So if we migrate and go in some other places, that would not be ours, and we will face difficulties. So this kind of thing is there. So they do not want to leave. So that's why our proposal is we really need to think the rights-based approach, giving the opportunity to the people so that they can take their decision for migration. Migration should be a choice, but not a compulsion. So we need to keep it in mind when we talk about the policy and when we, develop any policy for the climate-induced migrants. On the other hand, the protection is really, really important. In our current, I'll stop. In our current mechanism, labor migration corridor, the protection is really, really rare, and that's why people are facing abuse, exploitation, and when they're returning back, they're empty-handed, they don't have nothing, and they have very little scope to complain and get access to justice. So all these, actually, I'm reminding to you when we talk about policy and the framework, we really consider all these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shakirul. Thank you so much for really illustrating what regular pathways with policies that are right-based should mean in practice. But you also showed how far away we still are in fully implementing what is the vision, for instance, of the Global Compact on Migration in this regard. Now, what's the situation in the Americas?
Thank you. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for the opportunity to be here and to share a little bit about the situation in Latin America. Slow onset phenomena is occurring and is impacting on communities. Many of them have the possibility of attempting to adapt to changing conditions. However, in some cases, recurring situations such as flows that come every single year ultimately really thin the will of the people and force them to consider other options. You can lose your home once, you can lose your home twice, but are you gonna try for a third time to lose the few belongings and the little space you have. And that is an ongoing situation in many communities in Latin America. I also want to underscore that there are issues that in the global north are assumed as regular, such as having insurance for agriculture. That's not part of agriculture in Latin America. So when a peasant loses his or her crop as a result of drought or floods, they lose all of their resources, all of their capacity to survive for a whole year. And that, of course, has devastating impacts for communities. I would like to shed light on some opportunities that are available, nevertheless, in the Americas. They are not full, they are not about climate, but it's a little window of hope, just like the art that we saw today. And I think it's an invitation for us to think outside the box and to think creatively. In the Americas, we have two main and important efforts of integration that have included the possibility of free movement. One is the C4 agreement among the countries of Central America, that's Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, that allows people to move from one country to another. That is a promising first possibility of not requiring a passport and for allowing people to move in the region. What is also promising is that within that region, they have now moved forward to try to establish a joint visa program for nationals of other countries. And that could be the beginning of new possibilities of individuals coming from other parts of the world to consider remaining in those countries. Of course, the question is whether there are conditions of safety, whether there is possibility of employment with a full protection of labor rights, and the protection of women against gender-based violence and other elements that, of course, push people outside of that region. But I think it's little seeds of promise. In South America, we have the South American Conference on Migration, which is an effort that brings together South American countries to discuss immigration policy. It started also with a free movement agreement and also has a resident agreement, which enables a national from one country to request a temporary visa and then move to a permanent visa or permanent residence in the country simply on the basis of being a national of another country. That is a promising possibility to move within the region, which is also attractive, as we have seen, unfortunately, with the Venezuelan exodus, because of language and cultural elements that make integration into another society probably a little bit easier, a little bit friendlier. So I think that these are promising elements that enable us to think of what can be achieved if we begin to look at movements from this regional possibility. I also want to underscore two other promising elements. One is, and I mentioned this briefly, the Cartagena Declaration, which was adopted in 1984 to address the flows as a result of the armed conflicts in Central America. However, the Cartagena Declaration has continued to be enforced. Many countries of the region incorporated that expanded refugee definition into the legislation of their countries. And that's why we're having conversations or discussions about whether we can claim that climate change is a human rights violation, or whether it's a disturbance of public order, and we could use those expanded definitions, and that may be another window of opportunity. In that same regard, we have currently a discussion of a consultative opinion before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights requested by Chile and Colombia, which is around the climate emergency. There may be an interesting connection there with establishing that it is a human rights violation, then widening the door for the Cartagena Declaration. Finally, we have, more often than not, promising practices of countries that assume a pragmatic approach and decide to create regularization programs, accepting or realizing that they have a significant number of nationals from another country that are perhaps seeking asylum, that are remaining in the country, and that it is reasonable to think of regularization programs. I just want to mention one, the latest one from Costa Rica, which I think is another promising practice. They are not enough. They could be better. They could have less costs. There are things that could be improved. But I want to leave you with a little window of hope that there may be ways forward for us all to work on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena, for kind of making the picture complete. Because we have been starting with the communities, with their histories, with pressures to move. But then you are showing us that at regional, sub-regional levels, you can find solutions. And to anyone interested in migration law, if you really want to look at best practices, look at the laws of many countries in Central America, in South America. But you also mentioned the potential of free movement agreements. They are in fact one way allowing for people to move in situations of need. And that's an idea catching on if you're looking at the IGAD region in Africa, with now not yet entered into force, but still a text of a free movement agreement that contains a specific provision allowing people who want to migrate in anticipation of, during, or in the aftermath of a disaster, even if they don't have the passports that are usually required. So there are tools. There are many tools. It's not that we need to invent what regular pathways could mean and how this can be translated into laws and policies. But it needs to be linked into human rights protection, because otherwise people, yes, they can move, but then they end up in situations of exploitation. So we have 10 minutes for questions from the audience, both the audience in the room, but also those who are participating virtually. Yes, please. I have two here. It's a bit difficult. Can you pass it back? Then you're...
Teamwork.
Thank you. So this is not a question, but a contribution. I am Giovanni Charles from St. Lucia in the Caribbean, and today I represent those youth delegates who attended the summit, and this is about 50 of us. And I would like to say for sure that what was mentioned recently is a practice that we can get in the Caribbean as well. In the smaller island developing states, we have the OECS, the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean States, where there is free movement amongst islands. Of course, we are at the front line of climate change effects, and at any point we can be affected by climate-induced migration. But as part of the youth delegation, we came up with a few points that I would like to share. So we mentioned accurate data collection, which of course is very important. However, we have to take into consideration ethical considerations, protecting the rights and privacy of affected individuals. Adequate financing is crucial as well, and this is exploring innovative funding mechanisms. And moreover, we must ensure that the funds are directed not only towards economic and property-based loss, but we must recognize the various forms of loss: emotional, cultural, loss of your social aspects as well. You know, moving into another country, your entire representation in terms of your cultural identity, you might end up in some conflict. So we have to ensure that psychosocial support is provided for individuals. Let us not overlook also the power of art. As an artist myself, I would like to say a few things. Art humanizes the impact of these global issues. It fosters empathy and understanding. It holds the power to influence public opinion and policy discussions. Art inspires creative solutions and alternative perspectives. The emotional impact of art, it lingers in the memory of individuals, and this prompts individuals to reflect on their relationship with the environment and also their relationship with other humans. So art is basically a universal language that we could all relate to. Any culture, the basis of this would be art. So I would like to encourage everyone, let us amplify the voices of individuals. Let us use creativity, innovation. Let us use our skills and the power of art to help this entire advocacy, this entire movement go forward. And behind every statistic is a human face, a human story that is worth being told. I thank you.
Thank you. I'm Ranjan Panda. I represent the CMDP as well as the water initiatives in India. Very good presentations. I just want to say certain things like I was struck when Mamadou said about the 60s, 70s food aid and all. Then coming back to what you said on the art thing, the commons basically. I think when different situations are responsible for displacement and migration, but then when the people are migrated out, they're displaced, their identity becomes same. You know, it's a complex, diverse society, which then gets into one singular identity, a migrant or a displaced. And what he was very rightly said is, in this process, through the pathways, we have lost almost everything. The diverse, the cultural identities, the food, the systems, the kind of diverse knowledge, the relationships with commons. I think one danger that I see even in various global forums, the present solution might be a future problem. So what happened in India as well, we saw, every food systems got eroded, and now they're going back to the millets and other things in the name of climate, resilience again. So I think my contribution is not, the question is how we can actually do 2-3 things together. Is that not losing that identity, even when people have to move. But what Shakirul was trying to say is, like where we also work the same thing, many people don't want to move. So what, how to not change their relationship with the commons. The kind of, I always used to say, you have to, the right to nature and right to life are integrated things. You just cannot separate them. And if both are respected, I think we can do a lot of solutions at home. All these presentations, thankfully present a lot of, all this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Do we have any of the online participants who would like to come in? Just take the floor. We can't see who is online and who raising the hand. Anyone coming in? No? Okay, here we have another intervention from the room.
Great, thank you so much. My name is Hector and I'm the Climate Mobility Lead for MyCP. I have a question, and it's regarding the impact, the non-economic loss and damages resulting from climate mobility. In different regions, as our colleagues mentioned, there is the effects of climate change and environmental degradation go beyond economic losses. People would like to stay, people would like to remain for many reasons. How can we, especially now that I think about the global SDK4 mentioned non-economic loss of damage as a footnote. There wasn't really any mention besides we need to take care of this, but nothing else. How can we help communities? How can we come up with solutions to address this issue? How can we protect culture, our ties to the land, our ways of living? So that will be my question. How can we address the non-economic loss and damages? Thank you.
So I think there are really good points in there in terms of well-being for everybody, but particularly people who are Indigenous or who have deep connection to culture. There's a level of that being built into how do you keep well-being? So how do you maintain your identity? How do you form belonging? How do you preserve your languages, your culture, and things that meet a human rights-based approach? There's really good studies in this in terms of well-being, happiness, but also where your strengths are. So where your cultural identity is, celebrating those beyond just food, festivities, and fun, getting into the points of culture. Because I think for Pacific people, that's why they're so resilient, because they have that deep connection to belonging. They know where they fit between family, Mattingly, so their tribes, their islands. They have that deep connection, which is based in culture, and that is the form of resilience. So then it gets tied to criminal justice. So what are programs now that are successful for Indigenous communities, but other people of colour? It's connecting them back to culture, connecting them back to language, understanding what their history is, and where their strengths are. So for Indigenous, certainly in Australia, New Zealand, but other Pacific Island nations, that's being seen as a proactive strategy to reduce the impacts of crime, but also mental health issues, because we do have increasing numbers of, unfortunately, suicide amongst young people related to this whole sense of disconnection and separation from grief, intergenerational trauma. So it all hits the same. Thank you.
Anybody else from the panel?
Yeah, I would like to, your question, Hector, which I think is a very important and relevant question that we have to ask. We should not only think about economic losses, reminded me of members of our network who are indigenous organizations. They were indigenous communities in Guatemala or Mexico and have migrated to the United States. And their key element of their work is how to maintain culture. I think that there are lessons there that we can learn precisely in that same venue in terms of maintaining language, but also maintaining culture, how they maintain a tie, but also their ability to return. For many of them, it's critical to be able to return to their communities periodically as a way to maintain that community tie and that sense of belonging.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, in response to the question of economic loss or non-economic loss, I'll say that the first thing is, yes, when we are talking about non-economic loss, we also need to talk about economic loss. Because if the people have economic loss, like in forms of asset loss, by erosion, the other kind of economic loss, then they are actually forced to displace. And when they are, being displaced, then they are losing their other non-economic losses, like cultural and all these things. So we really do not need to separate economic loss and non-economic loss. Rather, we need to think in a combined way so that we can protect these. And how we will actually address, I will definitely say that we really think to do something from the community, from the ground, because the people have their own knowledge how to ensure their own belongings, how to ensure their both economic loss and non-economic losses. So it's not, we often say that is bottom up or top, what is called bottom up and then the top down approaches. But I must say that it always should be bottom up approaches, and we really need to respect the sciences, respect the knowledge of the local people, the community people, because they know how to survive, they know what they need to do. So I really appreciate if you consider from that approach. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there are different levels, and then if you look at what some of the cases that we have in West Africa particularly, you will see that there are those who are internally displaced persons. So they go to other communities, so the cultures may be different, but there is a kind of connection already because they belong to the same country. In that case, the municipalities have to play a big role. Because the culture is not only linked to the land, it's linked to the food system, it's linked to the way to dress, it's linked also to the way there is an interaction between this community and other communities. I'm talking about the way that they marry, the way that they celebrate and this like. So this is very important to have national policies that are dealing with this kind of local issues. It's very important just as a prevention, just to have rules and where welcoming these communities and then not making them binded to the practices that they are not used to is very important. But when it's come to displacement, beyond the borders, this is very critical in the sense that if you look at West Africa, there are similarities between the Sahel countries themselves, but there are also some differences. But when they go beyond that, they go to Europe, they impose all the practices, even their language become a problem. It's not because they cannot say it, they say they are not integrated, But integration doesn't mean that you forget everything that you have. You look at the Malian community in France, they have been really stigmatized because they continue to speak their language. The way that they wear their clothes, the kind of clothes that they are wearing is different from the others. Then they are stigmatized, and the racism is on board because the way that they're speaking. They think that it's refusing to speak French. It's not that, because the language is very instrumental in maintaining their culture and the way they are. And then there are some practices that can be questioned, but yeah, asking them to live out of all that is very problematic. You cannot just go beyond the issue of polygamy, the issue of, they are linked to the culture of people. And then it's very sensitive. You can sort it out in a way, but if you said that you get married to two wives because you are a criminal, it's another problem. You know, you cannot say it's criminalizing this displaced person because some of them are linked to the mobility issue. But it can be sorted out, you know, just recognizing that is a practice that they have in the cultural way, and then there is a kind of just not superposing things, but just making them carry more synergy on the cultural issue. So another culture on this is enriching it, not empowering with the one that exists in the community that we are hosting them. It's very important.
Thank you. Mary, some concluding remarks?
I think the only thing I have to add is the importance of living storytelling, truly living storytelling. I think about it from an arts perspective, and sometimes the museum seems to be like the mausoleum more so than a place where everything goes to live, be alive, and a plurality of voices can be heard. So what I would add is that we have to continually have live interaction, communication, bridge building, and living stories. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Before we thank this wonderful panel, may I invite Dr. Dan Oppon, Director of Immigration Services, Secretary of the National Coordination Mechanism of Kenya, to provide us with some concluding remarks. The reason is Kenya just took over the chairmanship of PDD, and we are so happy to have you in the chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Envoy, the Chair PDD, Excellencies, Ambassadors and Permanent Representatives, the Envoy, the PDD Chair, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, a good afternoon. First of all, I held back my laughter because you really provoked when you talk about culture and people, that somebody may brand you a criminal when you have two wives. It was very comical, but it's a reality in Africa. So to make concluding remarks, it is my pleasure and honor to join you here today. I want to thank you, PDD Secretariat, for convening this very important event. Kenya is pleased to co-sponsor this event alongside Fiji and Switzerland. Thank you both, as well all panelists, attendees, and organizers for your contribution today and for your collaboration to develop very inclusive and sustainable solutions to address human mobility in the context of climate change. I also thank you for your commitment to the vision, objectives, and work of the PDD. Climate change is an existential threat to our times, touching on different aspects, including human security. And with climate change, attendant aspects like erratic weather patterns, flooding, drought, famines, cyclones, and these extreme events directly and indirectly triggered by forced human mobility. Kenya knows this better than many other countries because we just suffered very prolonged drought, which actually affected the entire Horn of Africa, and the subsequent flooding and forced displacement of persons both within and across borders that both events of climate change triggered actually in Africa, and that part of Africa, particularly the Horn of Africa. There are nomadic communities that rely entirely on their animals. And when drought sets in, it means all their livelihoods are wiped out. And when floods come after the drought, they should be celebrating that there is water, at least animals will drink. But the floods normally wreak havoc and sweep downstream all their animals. So they live in perpetual cycle of poverty induced by the ravaging effect of climate change. At today's discussion at the GFMD Summit, it provides a valuable insight into the complexities of enhancing regular migration pathways in slow onset of climate change. For example, in the IGAD region, we are working on the free movement of persons, and also in Africa, the Continental Free Africa Trade Agreement envisages borderless Africa, where as part of the mitigation factors to climate-induced migration, we are talking about transhuman, where people are allowed to move with the animals in the face of hazards, diversities caused by climate change. Allow me also to add that beyond climate change, human mobility remains a complex and dynamic phenomenon globally. So mapping trends and patterns is important, and various tools and disciplines contribute to this. Art in this regard is crucial as an additional tool to contribute to the knowledge base of policymakers. We have seen that from the presentation of Ms. Mattingly. Thank you very much for that illustrative art. To policymakers particularly, art contributes to evidence base, which then can be applied for the formulation, implementation, as well as monitoring and evaluation of policies on human mobility and migration. I also wish to note that Kenya has dedicated a whole State Department for Environment and Climate Change that shows just how we take issues of climate change and human mobility seriously. The State Department, among other functions, includes supporting the government of Kenya in the formulation of policies and implementation of strategies to address the adverse effects of migration. Considering the transboundary nature of climate change and its impact, it remains very important to forge collaborations at different levels, from the communities to the national level, in the sub-regions, and globally. Cross-regional and interdisciplinary learning, including the incorporation of art, remain crucial to better understand the phenomena. but also to develop solutions, particularly for and with affected people. The power of art, including in helping to understand and engage in policy questions, is very well captured in the words of the American painter Georgia Okefe, who once said that, "I found I could say things with color and shapes that I could not say any other way, things I had no words for." I thank the artist, Mary Mattingly, who is present with us here today, as well as Platform in Absentia for their work on this issue. Kenya is a signatory to the GCM, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. And in this regard, Kenya is in line with the compact, is committed to engage the relevant stakeholders at different levels towards the implementation of the obligations to facilitate a safe human mobility. We are making strides in social inclusion of migrants and refugees, and including in national development programs. Actually, an example which probably most of you have heard, one of the best examples of coexistence between refugees and local communities is found in Kenya, in a refugee community in Kenya called Kalubei in Turkana, where programs are developed. There is what we have, what is called the Marshall Plan, the Shirika Plan, where the local communities and refugees coexist side by side, benefiting from programs developed by the government and the international community. As Kenya is preparing to assume the chairmanship of PDD, and that will come at an appropriate time, a ceremony at an appropriate time, which we are working on. We want to thank you very much for this session and wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. With this, we come to the end. And of course, I have to ask you for a strong round of applause for our speakers, our panelists. Thank you very much.